Welcome, Christian, to the IoT for All podcast. Thanks for being here this week.
Thank you for inviting me, Ryan. Glad to be here.
Yes, it's very good to have you. Let's kick this off by having you do a quick introduction about yourself and the company, and then we'll go from there.
My name is Christian Rouffaert. There's lots of vowels in that name, but I'm originally from Belgium, living and working in the UK in telecoms most of my adult life. And a few years ago, I started up my company Teragence, which uses crowdsourced data to create what we call actionable network insights, which is basically our core proposition is to deliver location specific, quantitative, and transparent data about network quality and mobile coverage anywhere, basically in Europe, North America, and a few other geographies. And been going a few years now.
Fantastic. That's awesome. So let's go ahead and jump into some questions here. I wanted to start off by asking you, just for our audience's benefit, maybe those that are new to the show and we're new to the industry in general, why is reliable cellular connectivity such a critical piece of the puzzle in today's IoT ecosystem?
Well, yes, that's a very good question. IoT stands for Internet of Things, right? That's everything with a connection that sends back information. That could be very fancy stuff, such as, robotic lawnmowers or robotic weeding machines that, weed the field automatically and send back information about what they see. Or it could be very simple things, such as a weather station that measures humidity or wind speed and sends that information back to a central location. The core value proposition, as we see it for IoT, is that you kind of replace the guy with a clipboard that collects the information or the operator with a connection, with a data connection that brings back the information. But to enable to either have that robot move around or the weather station send the information back, you need to have a data connection. And so a trustworthy, reliable data connection is almost the ground zero for then making all the fancy stuff work. And that's where we focus on that ground zero.
So, what are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to connectivity that IoT solution providers face, especially when we're talking about deploying at scale and even maybe across different geographies?
The first basic one is that if you're going to deploy 1,000 devices with SIM cards in it, let's just say for smart garbage cans or rubbish bins, as we say here in the UK, if you're going to deploy 1,000 of those, 900 will work fine in terms of the connectivity that's available in those locations. About 10 to 15, or maybe sometimes in certain geographies, 20% will have issues because of connectivity. And it's those 10 to 20% that really give you the grief, right? Because those are the ones that you install, you think you have done everything right, then it turns out to be wrong. Then you look at the screen and try to figure out what's going on. Then you have to send out your installer back. The costs ramp up, the customer gets unhappy, and people, if you're in quality theory, people say it's not the average that matters, it's the outliers that matter, right? And it's that 10, 20% of outliers of bad connectivity or unpredictable connectivity that really throw you off. So that's the kind of like base layer. What kind of connectivity is there? I think the second challenge that people often have is to go, okay, what technology is actually available? So if we talk about connectivity via cellular networks, we're talking about LTE-M and NB-IoT, and knowing what is available where in terms of good coverage and technology availability. Again, in that logic of solving the last 10 or 20% that causes 80% of the problems, that's really where the challenge is.
And I did want to ask you a kind of question that sort of expands on that, but it talks a little bit more about the ecosystem in general and kind of the overall value chain. I think for a lot of companies out there that are looking to adopt different IoT solutions, work with different service providers, there's often confusion or difficulty understanding the overall ecosystem and its value chain, especially between, or I guess specifically with the distinction between the connectivity side, so the potentially the MVNOs and then the IoT service providers, which are on the other side, and how companies are able to kind of articulate their value propositions. I know from kind of our earlier discussions, it sounds like that's something that you all have had to work on and kind of have a way to approach that. How do you look at that kind of problem and understanding when you're engaging with customers to help them understand the ecosystem, understand the value prop that not only you all provide, but other players that they may encounter?
Yeah, and that's interesting because when we started this company, my background was in, let's call it traditional telecoms. And I had read and heard about IoT, but it took us a while to get our heads around it. And if you think about how does IoT manifest itself in people's daily lives, is usually through a device, a smart meter, a smart robot, a weather station, a water meter, anything of those kinds. So we see it as a device that does something, usually measure or send some data back. But and the device has certain electronics and all that. So there is a risk to focus just on the device, but the device is just that, it's a piece of kit. That piece of kit has to talk back to base, so it needs connectivity. The connectivity is not provided by your traditional cellular operators. Sometimes it is, but more often it's not. So you have your Vodafones in the UK or your Verizons, but more often than not, there are specialized MVNO service providers that buy their raw cellular capacity from the traditional cellular operators, but then do a whole bunch of wraps around that connectivity service, around security and predictability and everything else. And then the wrap that sits around all of that is what we call the service provider. So this is the company that delivers to you the end-to-end service. So and it's probably mostly understood as a company that sells you the device with the connectivity, and then usually some kind of management console with that. And the interesting thing is that the value of connectivity for each of those players is very different. So the device manufacturer generally doesn't care that much because they just sell the device to the service provider. The connectivity provider sells their connectivity at a price of, a few pounds or a few pennies per month or per year. So they don't have a lot riding on that. But the service providers who sell a service that combines the device, the connectivity, and the management console, again, simplifying here, they often have an ARPU of multiple tens or hundreds of pounds or dollars riding on that. And to them, that connectivity is very, very important. That, missing that revenue or having to send out the installer to do it again, they suffer a lot of the cost. So we tend to focus on the end-to-end service providers and then the connectivity providers.
Have you ever come across a situation where working with a potential customer or company that you're working with, and you've had to convince them that you have a solution to a problem that maybe them and others just feel like is not something that can be solved? How do you kind of approach that, and how do you kind of go about getting them interested and kind of engaging in that way?
That's the story of our life pretty much, because when it comes to understanding available connectivity and what is where, generally people say, well, there's two ways. One is you go and look at some coverage maps, usually provided by the incumbent operators. And those coverage maps are judge and jury at the same time. So they always tend to be overly optimistic and nobody really rates them very highly in the industry. The other way of getting around to it is to do a survey yourself, is to go on the location, measure what's there, but that's very costly and doesn't really scale. So a lot of people in this industry go, well, it's a difficult problem, but it's unsolvable. So what are you going to do about it? We bring that solution and we bring that in a bite-sized way. So our value proposition is, if you want to know about for 50 sites or for 50,000 sites, you can do that with us. We have pricing plans and volume plans that fit with that. If people accept that a problem does not exist or that the problem is unsolvable, they're not necessarily going to look for the solutions. So we have to continuously across all channels say, there is a solution. Here's how it works. It is easy. And what happens is we kind of have to almost, I won't say quite saturate the channel, but we have to keep that awareness quite high. I call it the Coca-Cola strategy. You see Coca-Cola everywhere. Drink Coca-Cola, drink Coca-Cola. Do you drink Coca-Cola all the time? No, you don't. But when you're thirsty, you go, what shall I drink? You say, ah. So that's for us the same thing. We kind of have to make this continuous awareness marketing so that when the problem becomes acute, when you have that customer that is really pissed off and you go, okay, there must be a solution. And they go onto Google or they go onto LinkedIn and then they find us and then we propose our solution. That being said, as our reputation in the market grows, the word gets around and people are starting to find their way to us. But in the beginning, we had to articulate what we did, why it worked, how it could solve a problem that everybody thought was unsolvable. But that's now, as I said, as we plaster the walls with use Teragence, eventually people will come to us, and we have some really good customers now.
We've seen a lot of good success in companies that kind of take a similar approach where they understand that it's hard to go to a company and convince them they have a problem they haven't realized yet. But if they continually provide value through the marketing that they're doing, through the content they're putting out, just to help establish a presence in the market that these companies are likely engaging with, even kind of to a level like subconsciously, just through their browsing of LinkedIn, reading content, reading articles, once, like you said, it becomes acute, it becomes something that they actually realize and now have the time to dedicate resources to looking into solving. The idea is, and the hope is that, your company is the one that's top of mind for them, right? Like, hey, I read something about that, or I saw an answer to that problem the other day. And then they go back, they find it, and they're like, oh, this is the company that was behind that. Let me reach out to them. We've seen a ton of companies who have seen great success in that consistency over time driving them business.
Yes, absolutely. And then once you hit a certain level, it becomes self-perpetuating because then people change jobs, move across the industry, and take solutions with them to other companies. And then you drive that word of mouth. But it is that initial phase that you have to say, here's a problem, here's a solution. We are here if you need us. And by the way, we have done X for Y, and it was very successful.
One of the things that's come up many times in discussions in the past is the lack of transparency from mobile operators within the space. How does that affect businesses relying on IoT devices? Have you encountered that? Have people ever come to you and kind of brought that up as a topic? How do you kind of just view that as a general industry problem?
Well, it is a classic industry problem, and it exists at two levels. The first one is, as I said, nobody trusts the operator provided coverage maps or the coverage data provided by them because it's judge and jury, and especially, well, I'd say also in the US, but also in Europe, there's all there's always these pockets where operators say they're doing great, and it's not doing well. Um, and if you are in the IoT business, you always dread having that RFP come in that says we want to, 5,000 payment terminals. How can you guarantee connectivity? The second part where I think the industry can do a lot better is around not only uh, coverage data, but also technology availability. You know, where is LTM actually available? Where is MBIoT available? Really? Um, and how do the roaming agreements work? How international is really the presence? And this is where the telecom industry is defeating, to a large extent, itself because um, it doesn't communicate that information very well and it doesn't collaborate very well. So even the MVNOs that sit on top of that try to bridge that gap are struggling a little bit. We try to address that data or that data problem rather by almost crowdsourcing that NB-IoT and LTM data from the IoT service providers and creating a pool of information that at least is neutral and gives people a point of a starting point of understanding what is where available.
I wanted to ask you something more specifically about what you all are doing. So I know a lot of providers today depend on local operator data that they really can't verify. How are you kind of changing that model? What's the impact of having location specific or operator agnostic kind of coverage data? Just how does that work? What's the value of that? And just maybe talk to our audience a little bit more about that side of things.
As I said, our value proposition is that we provide location specific or location granular, quantitative and transparent data about mobile signal strength, which is a mouthful, but that each of those words means something specifically. So location specific means that we go down to a granularity of about 50 meters by 50 meters. So each 50 meters by 50 meters, in our case, hexagon has a specific value for a specific operator and a specific technology. We make that data transparent, that we let people know how we got there, and I will talk about that in a minute. I would do it quantitatively. We say this is the quantitative signal strength that you can expect. The magic sauce behind that formula is crowdsourcing. So we work mainly with app vendors, location-enabled app vendors that every time those phones take a location read, they also take a read of the mobile network they connect to. We buy that data in the background. We are very careful to be privacy respecting, but that gives us a large amount of data, or a much larger amount of data that we could obtain through any other ways. And that's really the raw material that enables us to create those data points. And then we apply a bit of machine learning and AI or algorithms, whatever you want to call it. The third layer that we put on top of that is data that we crowdsourced from the IoT ecosystem itself. So that's where we get the NB-IoT and LTM data. And by using basically large amounts of data with, call it, analytical machine learning cleverness, we can create that independent data that is based on ground truths and not just some projection or conjecture. And we can create that independently. That's really important. And so that's basically the secret sauce.
No, that's perfect. I appreciate the overview of that. And it'd be great if you could maybe expand on that. Give us an example of where your data helped a company maybe make a better deployment decision, maybe help avoid a costly mistake, something along those lines.
Well, the favorite story I have on that regard is about a year ago, we had somebody come to our website, enter in the form rather, saying we are, and we looked up this company, and it turned out that they were selling garden equipment, so leaf blowers and lawn mowers. And we kind of scratched our head and we said, "Are we sure these guys are talking to the right people? Because we can't immediately see the use case." Anyways, we had a call with them and they explained to us that they had created a next generation of robotic lawnmower. So something like a Roomba that just automatically mows your grass and keeps it nice and tidy. The challenge of these things is where a Roomba knows that it hits the end of the floor because it hits the wall and it turns back. That doesn't exist for lawnmowers. You know, if they keep on going straight, they will go into the flowers and destroy the flowers, which is not what you want. So they need to know where the edges of the lawn. Traditional way of doing that is burying a cable on the edge of the lawn, but you're basically digging up the lawn to save the lawn, which is not very good. So these guys had developed a robotic lawnmower that used high precision GPS and a cellular backhaul. These things retail for £1,000 plus. The challenge they had is people would come in their shop, say, "I quite fancy a next generation lawnmower." People said, "Fantastic, you know, let me swipe your credit card for £1,000. We'll come and install it next week." The next week would come around. They come to this beautiful garden. Turns out the cellular connectivity wasn't up to scratch. At that point, that customer has lost £1,000 worth of sale. So what this customer now does is they connect to our API. When a customer comes in, they verify the address, see if there's sufficient cellular coverage for the deployment of their solution, and then proceed to selling them the cellular solution, if appropriate, or another solution there. And that creates that additional £1,000 sale or $1,000 sale at that 10 or 20% level, which is significant, right? And it's always my favorite story because it comes from such an unexpected angle. Another story is a water metering company that we work with. So they monitor water levels in sewers and rivers and all that. They use our system to ascertain the connectivity in a deployment location. And if the connectivity is not good enough, they shift a bit to the left or to the right to where the connectivity is good, thereby ensuring right first time installs. And they've gone on record saying they save about 15% on their deployment costs. So those are our war stories that I really like, that really bring our proposition to life.
How do you approach gathering and validating kind of this level of granular coverage intelligence that we're kind of high level talking about here across different regions? So Europe, North America, the Middle East, like what are you doing kind of when it comes to like handling all of that in different regions of the world?
The first point is to know that we work with, um, apps that have a global footprint. So we collect global data. We work with specialized, when we take on a new country, we work with specialized benchmarking companies to do a few sample readings in certain locations and compare that against our own data and readings. But the most best test or the hardest test is always what I call the grandma test. The grandma test goes something like this. We are at an event, we do our pitch, and people say this is really clever and interesting. But I bet you don't know where what the situation is where my grandma lives. And they go, and then I go, where does your grandma live? And my grandma lives in this little village in the mountains or in the back of beyond, or have this holiday home. Can you tell me what is happening? And we go to the holiday home and we say, is it right here on the map? And they go, yes, it's there. We do the test, and I'd say 95% of the time we get it pretty much damn right. And so as we do a continuous series of grandma tests, we prove the value of our system. And this is really in locations where we have never been. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, I was doing this kind of test with somebody who lived in deepest Kansas and wanted me to check the signal on a crossroads and compare that to his own experience. And we got that down to it. So we do it formally, and then we do the grandma test. And I really like the grandma test.
That's awesome. So last thing I have before I let you go here is if you kind of we look ahead, how do you see the role of independent, transparent connectivity intelligence really evolving as IoT continues to expand into even more, especially mission critical use cases? So kind of what does the future look like from here and kind of beyond?
We continue to evolve our data. So not only our data collection, but also the application of um, AI and machine learning techniques and blending different sources to get ever better view of what is happening on the ground. We'd like to hope or think that the operators eventually will come on board on this and will look to help create that kind of objective view rather than the judge and jury view that they want to create. Um, and of course, the last thing that you hope, well, we don't hope, but we actually do hope that the technology gets to such a level that we don't need those benchmarks. The reason that those benchmarks are now needed is that the service is not quite what it needs to be. But for us, we are very excited about everything that has to do with data in a geospatial context. Putting data on a map is actually very, very exciting. And what you can learn and extract from that, be it around connectivity, be around device deployment, is actually really exciting. And that's the space that we have our eyes on for the future.
And for our audience who wants to learn more about what you're all doing, reach out maybe with follow-up questions, engage further after listening to this. What's the best way they can do that?
The best way to do that is to go to our website, which is teragence.com with one R, not two R's, or contact us via LinkedIn. I'm not I'm no longer of the age that I use TikTok, and I have stopped using Twitter a long time ago. So email or the old fashioned web, at teragence.com is the best way to reach us.
Well, Christian, thank you so much for coming on here. Pleasure to have you on, talking about everything that you have. You're kind of working on in the space, things that you're doing differently than other companies. I think what you have going on is fantastic. So excited to hopefully have you back maybe later this year into next year. We can talk more about kind of how the industry and the ecosystem's evolving, the role you're all playing, and kind of any new things that are happening on your front. So thank you again for your time, and it was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Ryan, and have a good day.